transit adopts something, they don't buy one car, like a household buys a car, but transit buys a fleet. They'll buy 10, then they'll buy 50, then they'll buy 100. So the amount of infrastructure it needs, the battery sizes will never be big enough to accommodate just depot charging. It's not enough to think about buses charging in the depot overnight. You need buses charging on the road, you need hydrogen as part of the solution, and then you need to redesign your blocks in your system. So typically we don't get one-to-one replacements. Even with hydrogen, we get closer to one-to-one replacements, but we still don't get there, which means you have a higher fleet replacement ratio, so you need more buses. So like, even if you want to buy it today and you have all the money in the world, you can't. You cannot buy it in most of the country. So that is the timeline of when will there be more hydrogen production online based on government investment.
My guest today is a human equivalent of a battery electric bus. Efficient, unstoppable, and definitely not running on fossil fuels. Dr. Josipa Petrunic is the president and the CEO of Qtrek, where she's been rewriting the rules of zero-emission transit while juggling data models, government policy, and occasionally the patience of transit agencies across Canada. She's launched the national trials for electric and hydrogen buses, built one of the continent's most respected clean transit networks, and if that wasn't enough, she's also developed Canada's first mathematical simulation tool for transit electrification, because apparently just being brilliant wasn't hard enough. From lecture halls to national policy tables, she's been pushing zero-emission transit like it's her life's playlist on repeat. Please welcome Dr. Josipa Petrunic. Josipa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Before we dive in, I want to understand you. What was the moment maybe in your life or career that made this mission of decarbonizing transit personal for you?
Well, actually, it happened about 15 years ago when I was finishing my PhD and then working in research. I was actually in the automotive industry, working with auto manufacturers as a researcher. And I also, at that time, had just run for politics and I lost. And then I ran again and I lost again. And so you learn a lot when you lose a lot of political elections. And then working in that sector in Canada, it was very clear that the automotive sector around that time is 2012, 2013. They were under a lot of pressure to innovate. And it was the time of a lot of money coming into the system from the Obama era. And it was the rise of this new period of electrification and autonomous vehicles. But the auto companies being the auto companies in North America, it's profit driven, it's private mobility, and it has nothing to do with moving people effectively or efficiently. So we were able to start kind of an innovation center and got a lot of companies in Canada involved in thinking about, could we lead the way in Canada on autonomy, on electrification, et cetera. But the problem in Canada is we don't have headquarters of automotive companies anymore. We have branch plants, but the headquarters are in Japan, the headquarters are in Korea, the headquarters are in the United States. So a lot of the most important technological decisions are not made in Canada, even if the cars are made here. And so at that time, I learned that the transit industry in Canada was trying to do technology innovation as well. And for a country as big as ours, and as someone who had never really owned a car, because I had gone to school in London and lived in Paris and lived in Toronto, and you just don't own a car when you live in these big cities. I really realized that technology innovation in public transit was maybe a faster way to get things like electrification and autonomous vehicles out the door. And so when I heard that this was starting to happen and there was a bit of money for kind of startup company, a startup nonprofit to be formed, I went into that pitch round and I pitched the idea of an innovation consortium that could be built on electrification, autonomy, big data, and cybersecurity. And the transit industry agreed. So in Canada, we kind of had a history of transit, public transit, not being very innovative. It's old diesel buses. You bend some metal around an engine, and that's about the bulk of it all. But what's really inspiring is lots of people take transit in Canada, and it's growing. And when transit adopts something, they don't buy one car, like a household buys a car, but transit buys a fleet. They'll buy 10, then they'll buy 50, then they'll buy 100. So that's that was kind of the moment that inspired me. Was there was this interest and this demand in transit. They were willing to put a bit of money into it, almost like venture capital, but they didn't have the people in the industry to do it. Meanwhile, we had the knowledge and the people in automotive, but there wasn't the interest in supporting this kind of deployment in automotive. So those things merged, and in 2014, then into 2015, I came into this role, and we started and launched Futric in 2016, and the rest is history. After that, we rolled up our sleeves and started trying to get some projects out the door that were really complicated, but in the end, effective and successful.
Wow. So basically, instead of making you a politician, God decided to make you his transit angel.
Maybe, but I still want to be prime minister. Who's kidding? We don't, you never know. I think it's probably a good idea to know a lot about public transit if you want to be prime minister. So we might find full circle by the time I'm 60.
When I hear your ambition, I'm getting that serious. But let's start by asking you something quite simple and logical. If we are pouring billions globally into decarbonizing public transit, why does it still feel like we're so far from getting it right?
Yeah, I would say that the industry is only really 10 years old and only 5 years of semi-maturity. So we are only a decade in. And to put it in context, in this industry, in public transit, electrification in cars has been going since the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So it's much longer history. But in heavy duty public transit, it's really only a decade old as an industry. So we're not doing too badly as a global industry. And in North America and Europe, there's a lot of headway and movement in terms of fleet deployments. But to be frank, there's three big things that are challenges that create hindrances that we have to overcome. The first is electrification in public transit is not like cars. And we had to overcome the idea that in the public sector, like government, you'd go to government and start talking about money for this stuff. And they thought it's like cars. Okay, plug in, low power, the bus goes out on the road, returns back, you plug in overnight. That does not work for public transit, certainly not in Canada. These buses are out on the road 20, 22 hours. Your car is in your garage most of the time. The energy that the bus uses is massive. So the amount of infrastructure it needs, the battery sizes will never be big enough to accommodate just depot charging. So the complexity was one of the first things to get over, is that it's not enough to think about buses charging in the depot overnight. You need buses charging on the road. You need hydrogen as part of the solution. And then you need to redesign your blocks in your system. So that was the first big challenge, and has taken several years to get people to wrap their minds around how complicated it is. And therefore, it's a system overhaul. It's not just a bus conversion. The second thing that has been a challenge is when you look at a system overhaul, like when you deploy battery electric buses rather than the diesel equivalent, you usually need more because of the range, because of the charging, because of the uptime and downtime. So typically we don't get one-to-one replacements. Even with hydrogen, we get closer to one-to-one replacements, but we still don't get there, which means you have a higher fleet replacement ratio. So you need more buses. And so the result of that is most transit agencies were not prepared to build a new garage or build new space or build more power. And all of a sudden you had the idea, you had the notion, maybe you had the money, but you weren't ready for the extra costs with facilities and power upgrades and infrastructure. That was the second big challenge, is getting energy systems and the complexity. And then the third challenge is just you still have people in the industry who 20 years ago tried hybrid buses and they didn't work out well. And so they are anti-technology innovation. They don't want to move it forward at transit because they were burned before. We have that problem with hydrogen in Canada. It's taken us almost the full 10 years to get people over a challenging experience we had during the Olympics in Whistler over 13 years ago. So you've got these three things together. It's complicated. It leads to huge facility and very costly growth. And then you still have people who have been burned in the past from new technology. You combine those things, and that explains a lot of why it's taking a little bit longer than everybody hopes to go green.
We'll definitely come to these questions. I've noticed that the Q-Trick itself includes some traditional OEMs still working in fossil fuel industry. How do you hold both of these three realities, the vision of zero emissions and reality of legacy industry ties?
Well, two things, one on the rolling stock and then one on the energy side, right? Who makes the energy that's used? On the rolling stock side, like who makes the buses in Canada? There are two big players, New Flyer Industries and Nova Bus, which is part of Volvo Group. There were two startups that emerged. We had BYD coming in from China through the United States, selling into Canada recently. That has come down because we now have a tariff, 100% tariff against electric vehicles from China. Wow. So that's been a challenge. And then we had the startup of Proterra, which was a bunch of guys from Tesla who left Tesla years ago to start up an electric bus company in California. They started very aggressive sales. They got some sales and they've gone bankrupt. So we're back to the two main manufacturers. The thing is that the stories that emerged is public transit is not, again, like automotive. A new model comes out and people want to buy it because it's sexy and cool and well marketed. Public transit in Canada is purchased by cities mostly and regions, and it's operated by unionized labor. In Europe, a lot of public transit is outsourced. So, like the city, for example, hires a private company to operate. That private company buys the buses or leases the buses. That's not how it happens in Canada. In Canada, the city owns the workers, employs them as union labor, and they buy the assets and they operate and maintain it. So it's a lot harder to sell vehicle systems into Canada. And so that's why a lot of manufacturers around the world just don't, because the volume is small, the economy is small, the profit margins are small, and you have 10,000 steps to go through to sell into the marketplace. And those are those legacy OEMs. Now, the good news is those legacy OEMs started the innovation cycle early. Like they definitely did not need to be prodded. I mean, Nova Bus, part of Volvo Group, was learning already from European electrification before Proterra showed up. And New Flyer is the only manufacturer, as far as we know, in the world that offers all of the platforms out there: diesel, clean diesel, CNG, RNG, CNG, hydrogen, battery electric, depot charge. So they offer all the platforms. So I can't really say legacy bus manufacturers are at all a problem. In fact, they're part of the innovative solution. So that has worked in our favor in a small market like Canada. The fossil fuel companies, again, small market, we have had to rely on some of the fossil fuel companies like Enbridge, which is an oil and gas company, but they were the ones with the money to install an electrolyzer to start producing hydrogen off the green grid. So as a result of this very small pockets of money in energy, the result is that those fossil fuel companies are actually some of the first who made green hydrogen possible. The benefit is within our membership, we've also attracted the startup companies that have come around to try to promote and grow hydrogen outside of a fossil fuel industry. But I think we all have to be reasonable about the fact that a lot of the energy dollars for risky innovations like building electrolyzers comes from the profits that oil produces. And currently, that's where the nexus of energy production is in the country in Canada.
So, actually, we were starting with hydrogen from my next question, but now I'm interested in your reports. Many of your reports use model data on emission reductions. How do you ground this data models in the real world?
Yeah. So there's a couple tools. I mean, we look at both predictive and then empirical, right? And we do our best on predictive to be real world, evidence-based empirical data, but you don't really know how things will perform until they're actually out on the road, and then you really get the empirical data. So it's a virtuous circle between the predictive assumptions and the empirical data. In terms of how we ground it, just to like get out of academic speak, basically we get the specifications for the vehicle systems from the OEMs, but then we run averages for any of those vehicles that are on the road. We look at how they're actually performing. So we do modify the specifications. And that's important because if like a manufacturer is saying, hey, my motor operates at this high level of efficiency, say 95% efficiency, and my power electronics have like no thermal losses, right? And my battery has no degradation, you're going to get like 100% for 12 years, which is what some of those startup manufacturers were promising years ago. We know by the laws of physics that's not true. So we take the OEM specifications, but we take the fact that they are often sales specifications. And then we take a look at also academic literature in laboratory where there's deconstructed engineering to see how fast do things degrade if they haven't been on the road for very long. And then if they've been on the road, we take whatever models have been on the road, and then we see what the degradation is, and we try to balance what the manufacturer says they're making and believes they're making with what we're seeing on the road. And we come to kind of middle ground of evidence-based assumptions. On the energy side, it's very similar. We have very clear data in Canada about the production of the grid. Like a lot of jurisdictions, we know where the electrons are coming from. We know what the grid composition is in detail. And then we use, again, specifications on how efficient is the electrolyzer. And then we add losses on top of that. We always add additional losses on top because we know there's thermal losses. We know there are losses along the way, all the way to the battery pack. And it's nobody's job to track that except for us. So we try to ground it in just like the basics of physics. Basic Newtonian physics will tell you that there's lots of losses along the way every time there's a connection and any kind of flow of energy. That's how we base it. And we've been happy to see that a lot of our predictions are very real world compliant. However, and this is the caveat, they're real world compliant in that we have about 300 electric buses on the road in Canada, only a couple hydrogen fuel cell buses. In the next 4 years, if the federal funding stays, we should have about 1,000 buses coming online. All of the buses we monitor, all the charging systems, the electrolyzers, they're only a few years old. So although our predictions match pretty good right now, in 5 years, even though we took into account degradation, we might be wrong. It might be that in 5 years, these way more than we expect. It might be in 5 years, they don't degrade as much as we expect. And in the first 3 years, we've seen both. We've seen some systems perform way better than we expected, and some perform worse than we expected. And we're able to dig into it. And sometimes it's the battery management system. Sometimes it's the charger software connectivity. Sometimes it's thermal losses elsewhere in the system and auxiliary loads that are perfect. And then sometimes it's just the driver. It's just the driver who is driving inefficiently or fueling inefficiently. Something human is causing losses that is not associated.
He's been having a hard day, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and to put it in context, in Canada, because it's all unionized, we have to be really, really precise about who's touching what. And this is a big issue. Does the driver touch the charger? Is it the driver's job to plug the charger in? Does the driver touch the fueling system for hydrogen? These are big questions. And the reality is, if it is, and if it has to be mandated and training isn't there, then you're definitely going to get losses along the way. You're going to get inefficient charging. You're going to get mistakes. You're going to get faults. You're going to get all problems.
There's been a lot of advocacy around hydrogen buses. But when you look at the real adoption in Canada, it seems slow. What's stopping it from taking off like it was supposed to?
Yeah. Well, there's two big things. In Canada, we were actually one of the first in the world to deploy a fleet of hydrogen fuel cell buses, and that was for the Whistler Olympics in British Columbia in 2010. And at that time, it was Ballard, which is based in Canada for fuel cell stacks, New Flyer, which is a Canadian bus manufacturer, and then there was an American powertrain integrator. And that American company went bankrupt midway through the project. So the buses were made, there are about 30 of them. They were deployed by BC Transit, and to the credit of the manufacturers like New Flyer and Ballard, putting these vehicles together, and BC Transit, which operated them, these buses, which was like a first generation hydrogen fuel cell electric bus in Canada, they operated in the mountains of British Columbia, like the Rocky Mountains. It's not like they were on flat roads in the prairies. They were on really, really difficult terrain in the middle of winter, mind you, right? So these buses get out on the road. They were performing reasonably well, but as you might expect, especially with first deployments of new technology like this, there were failures, there were maintenance issues, there was problems to fix along the way. And because the powertrain integrator had gone bankrupt, there was no one to fix it. So the buses themselves did a great job of being innovative, getting out the door, and actually performing reasonably well. The problem is nobody thought to replace the integrator with a project manager that could fix the problem, a maintenance team. And so everybody's learned since that time that you don't break up the vehicle system. And that's why manufacturers today run their maintenance on these things. They don't hand it off to someone else. However, BC Transit ended up, as a result, not having a maintenance staff to take care of these vehicles, to fix them up when a problem arose, and they got rid of all of them. They sold them off. Some were sold for parts and disassembled. Some were sold off for showcases. So they got rid of all of them. And so this amazing trial that produced amazing data that could have led to the second, third, fourth generation across the country ended up being disbanded and buried in a cemetery effectively. And the chill is big. Transit tends to be conservative around technology. It's not a big industry. Everybody knows each other in Canada. So when that happened, there was immediate chill across the country that hydrogen buses had failed. That was not true. The project management had failed, but the hydrogen buses hadn't failed. But try telling that to someone who was convinced by BC Transit staff that it was an absolute cataclysmic failure, right? So people were burned, and it took us 10 years to get over that. That is the single biggest reason why it has been slow in Canada. The technical issues have been resolved. We're into third generation fuel cell buses. The fuel cell stacks are twice as efficient. The fuel cell buses go 3 times as far. You're just way better in a generational deployment. But that culture has taken more time than anything to shift among people who were touched at that time and are still employed in the transit industry.
So at that terrain, can you just use battery buses?
No. So here's the thing, and this is the challenge. So just take BC Transit as an example. They were burned by that project. Hydrogen fuel cell technology makes a ton of sense in the Rocky Mountains. Range alone, plus you have to add in the fueling. And keep in mind in Canada and North America in general, hydrogen fuel cell buses are electric buses. They're run off an electric motor with an electric battery. So it's really a hydrogen fuel cell range extender to an electric vehicle. It's a hybrid vehicle. In Europe, you can get models where the hydrogen propels the system directly, but here you don't. In North America, it's all electric buses with a hydrogen fuel cell stack and hydrogen range extender. So in this case, you fuel up and you can fuel up with 37.5 kilograms on the tank, and you can now top up with some modular top up to add more kilograms. That allows for relatively fast, infrequent fueling requirements in the Rocky Mountains with weather conditions that will impact range of the electrified vehicle, including the hydrogen bus and its battery pack. It makes a ton of sense, but because they were so burned by that project and just the PR and the branding and the cost, BC Transit has been dedicated to battery electrification. Fast forward to where we are now, they have just purchased their first battery electric buses. So it took over 15 years for them to get to a stage to buy their first battery electric buses. That tells you how hard it is to electrify in that terrain with battery electric buses. And some of those first buses are being deployed in the small cities that are relatively flat. The reality is, by the laws of physics, that transit agency is going to have to come back to hydrogen fuel cell tech. But the culture barrier that has led to kind of the block is massive. In other jurisdictions, though, we've moved ahead in Mississauga, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and now north of Toronto, around Mississauga, we have several agencies that have done the science with us. They are fully aware that based on highway driving, you could be going up a mountain or driving fast on a highway. The load is pretty much the same to the vehicle, right? So highway driving, high speeds, low downtime, high uptime, lots of ridership, lots of weather variations. Most of our transit agencies in these dense environments are very well aware they need hydrogen buses. So it's moving forward elsewhere in Canada. And now we have the funding portfolio just in the last 3 years that actually supports it. So from the outside looking in, it looks like it's taken epically long. And for someone who's been working in the industry for over a decade, it feels like it's been epically long. But when I talk to my transit colleagues, they often say, this has been going so fast. Like, this is moving so fast, right? So to be fair, it's moving at the speed that transit moves and a little bit faster. And that's good enough for me because it's not stagnant. It's not stagnant. It's not going backward. It's going forward, just not as rapidly
I'm
as we want.
glad we actually jumped right into this discussion and skipped through so many questions, also due to the time constraints. But I wanted to ask you a few things. One of them is, it seems to me that Qtrick is these days talking less about hydrogen and a little bit more about battery electric bus. Is that just my feeling, or?
Yeah, I think that's probably perception based on what studies got finished first. So we do both equivalently, I would say. We have a massive demonstration project on electric bus and over 30 studies and feasibility studies for electric bus for the agencies. We have over 30 studies on hydrogen fuel cell electric bus, and we have a massive hydrogen fuel cell electric bus deployment coming up. It's just that the hydrogen one came after the battery electric, so it might be perceived. But from our perspective, we're both equally, and we're equally involved in cybersecurity now. So from our perspective, like what we are seeing in general is the transit agencies that have 200 or more buses in Canada will tend toward needing a combination of either depot charging and en route charging if it's battery electric, or they'll need a combination of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell. And because people don't want en route opportunity charging because they're high powered chargers, they're expensive, they're over $1 million each. You have to dig up road, you have to install them on the road. It's complicated with pantographs and downtime. We're seeing now a culture shift to say, can we replace that with more hydrogen buses? So I would say we're in the zone where we're 50-50 in terms of the agency that we're working with. But now with tariffs, I will say, with the rise of Donald Trump and the new president, that has thrown things into disarray to some extent. After the pandemic, everybody was just dealing with inflation. Like the price of buses, chargers, fuel, it all went up 30%, right? It was very expensive, and not like the taxpayer was paying 30% more taxes. So suddenly we had less money to buy what we needed to buy for electrification or decarbonization. Then comes Donald Trump, and during that period, because Donald Trump has imposed tariffs that are very They come, they go, they're on one day, they're off. Steel, aluminum, copper, all these things, it has led to spikes in prices along the way. And so what we're seeing now is agencies that are fully committed to decarbonization are pausing. In some cases, they're buying diesel hybrid again, or CNG. And that is just because the price spikes caused by tariffs and inflation. And the money that they have, the delta is not being covered by anybody, but they need 100 buses and they had money for 100 electric, but now they can't afford 100 electric, so they're buying 100 diesels or CNG. So we do see a bit, I won't say the pendulum's swinging back. It's not going in reverse. It's a reluctant requirement to purchase buses right now that are priced out of their capability until government policy catches up to the tariff regime. So that's what we are seeing a little bit of now, but I expect that we will overcome it once we have some trade.
I can tell you already, talking to you for 45 minutes is just a warm up. So we like.
So that's just
I'm not considering
so,
this one as an interview. We will do a proper podcast, like 2 hours for sure. So,
well, you did say at the beginning, you were very kind and you said that I was brilliant. I don't think I'm brilliant. I think I'm annoying. But, squeaky heel gets the grease, and you say it enough, and you say it with logic and some rationale and evidence, and eventually you will get
like the fact that you can handle hard questions, and you're answering them. So, and this podcast is all about being actually transparent and objective. And my next question, I wanted to ask you about the Brampton report. Why wasn't the carbon pricing or social cost of carbon factored into that hydrogen modeling, especially when that's national policy?
Yeah. For sure. So, well, two things again associated with that. The timing was one. So normally, like our normal is that we want to bake in carbon pricing, right? And we would incorporate that into the economic model. But in Canada, at that time that we started the Brampton study, although we're publicizing it now and producing it now, it was over 2.5-year study. So it started back really in 2022, 2023, we did the first data collection. It wasn't until 2024 we came out with the first reports, and in 2025 we started publicizing. It was massive, right? It's like a 600-page analysis. At that time, when we first started talking to Brampton about all the variables we wanted to look at, Ontario was just coming out of having canceled the carbon market. So the province of Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia had carbon pricing markets in place. Heading into the current government of the day today, that current government got elected and canceled carbon market pricing. So in Ontario, it doesn't exist. In most provinces in Canada, carbon markets don't exist except for British Columbia and Quebec. And so there was initially this, okay, let's go and price carbon because there's a carbon market and we will have to buy into it and industry will have to pay for carbon produced and maybe we can even gain credits. But he was canceled. So then there was a chill on whether there was any need to actually do that pricing or whether that was just kind of hypothetical. So we thought, okay, at minimum, what we could do is hypothetically pricing carbon in the future. And behind closed doors, we did do a lot of analyses on what would a hypothetical price of carbon be. But because there isn't actually a carbon market in Ontario, the decision was not to pursue it. But what is baked in is carbon taxes, because at the time we did the study, there's a federal carbon tax. Now, mind you, the federal carbon tax has been canceled since that time as well. So it doesn't exist in Canada, but the federal carbon tax was incorporated in the price of diesel when we modeled it. So there was no carbon credit in the study because Brampton can't get carbon credits. There is no provincial carbon crediting regime. And there was a carbon tax baked in the price of diesel. Where we need to redo a piece of work, though, and this is new because of new regulation that came up after we were already almost done the project, and where we're encouraging all transit agencies to look at it is in the federal carbon pricing regulation. At the federal government level in Canada, there is still a carbon market. It's just very, very, very limited to fossil fuel producers and a few players in the market. Our goal is that it applies to everyone, but for right now, it's mostly fossil fuel industry that has to buy carbon credits. And recently, in the last couple of years, the regulation, when it came out, the Clean Fuel Standards, it had one tiny clause broken in 2 paragraphs in like tons of pages where it said, if you have electric chargers, you can collect credits from the electric chargers. So that came out several years ago. The problem with the policy is it was written with the idea of car chargers in mind. And so what it writes in there is only if the chargers are for public use do they qualify. And then you can take the avoided diesel or gasoline, turn it into a credit, and get carbon credits. The problem for public transit in Canada is the chargers at the depot are paid for by the public and they're for public transit, but they're not publicly usable, right? Like as a car driver, I can drive in and use that charger. And then the ones that are on the road are these high power 450 kilowatt chargers that no car can plug into, and they're not available because they're there for the buses. So we spent about a year negotiating with the federal government to say, hey, listen, your intentions are right, that anybody with a charging system that displaces diesel or gasoline should get carbon credits and should get that money. But the way the policy is written, it doesn't allow transit to apply. And so that took us about a year back and forth to get clarity that, okay, the language is ambiguous. It could have been written better, but transit can get recognized as public if we can contend that it owns and operates the chargers. It hasn't outsourced owning and operating. So in Canada right now, they own and operate their chargers. So several agencies are now going through the process. And at Qtrick, we're starting up a nonprofit wing. We're going to spin off a business just to do this for transit. Because you might, like Brampton, you might have half a dozen chargers, high power and low power right now. But the legal paperwork to get them regulated is like a PhD. Okay, so you have to hire like a full-time lawyer to fill in these papers just to get the credits for a few chargers. So what we're going to try to do is pull together everybody in the country. There's not that many transit agencies. It's Canada. We're only 40 million people large. It's manageable. So we're going to try and pull together all the agencies. There's only probably about 50 chargers in the whole country that would be eligible. You know, not that many for transit. Maybe 100 if we count every small charger in the depot. And what we're going to try and do is pool them into an aggregated pool and apply so that they are feeding into an aggregated pool. So every small agency doesn't have to go find a lawyer at an expensive rate to fill a PhD of paperwork. We're going to see if we can make it easier for the carbon credit, but that explains to you why it wasn't in the Brampton study. Now studies going forward, we are baking this
worldwide problem of bureaucracy.
Well, it comes from a good place. It's just you have to realize, like, there's not cash to burn, right? And hiring a lawyer, that's a lot of money for an agency just to do that. They could be buying a bus with that money.
The hydrogen buses in your model were pushed far out in time, which made the cost look cheaper due to inflation. Was that a conscious decision? And if so, why that timeline?
Yeah, it was a conscious decision based on hydrogen supply chain. So right now, while there are hydrogen buses and they're coming off the lot and they can be deployed and you can order one and it's standardized and you can get it delivered, we can't get hydrogen. So our hydrogen supply chain in Canada is terribly built out. There is a lot of hydrogen for the pharmaceutical industry, for the cement industry, but it's not purified hydrogen for transportation. Right now, and even when we started, the only electrolyzer functioning was an Enbridge electrolyzer in North Toronto producing 1 ton of green hydrogen. That's it. And so 1 ton can fuel about 30 buses. So if you're in Mississauga, that's the fuel we're going to apply to you, that we're going to be able to get to your fuel cell buses in North Toronto. But the rest of Canada doesn't have access to that, and it's only for 30 buses. Enbridge has not declared that it will grow it to 5 tons until they see transit ordering buses, but transit won't order the buses until they see the hydrogen exists. Chicken and egg. So in the last few years, we got several provinces to invest in building hydrogen capacity. There are now new hydrogen production plants coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. They were started a few years ago. As a result of that, it'll be about 2028, 2029 into 2030. By the time there is green hydrogen or low carbon gray hydrogen available reasonably to most transit agencies in the country, and even still in the prairies and some other jurisdictions, they won't have access very easily without very long distribution supply chains. So the conscious choice was not about the bus technology. It wasn't even about the physics of when it needs to be deployed or how. It was really about when can you reasonably expect to even have hydrogen.
So it's about actually the price of hydrogen.
It's the availability and the price. So like, even if you want to buy it today and you have all the money in the world, you can't. You cannot buy it in most of the country. So that is the timeline of when will there be more hydrogen production online based on government investments. And then there's the price. So the price was originally, very, very high for hydrogen. If you look at the United States, there's hydrogen available for transportation around $12 American, right, per kilogram. So you're looking at that saying, okay, that we should be able to get there because our electricity is pretty cheap, not in all jurisdictions in Canada, but we should be able to get there, and our electrical grid is pretty green. Our hydrogen, the cheapest you can get our hydrogen for right now through really intensely negotiated arrangements, is around the $30 a kilogram, and that's extremely low for a temporary period. And some of the early deployments out west in Canada are paying $70 to $100 a kilogram.
Yeah.
So it's impossible, right? Because it's low volume, the price is through the roof, and $70 to $100. I mean, diesel is equivalent of $6 to $7 a kilogram. So there's just no way, right? And so this is why, from the modeling, we're not going to model something that nobody's going to buy. We work with the transit agencies and we say, here's the reality of the supply chain. Here's the reality of when we can expect generation to come on board. And then here's the reality of price points. So in the Brampton case, we used very optimistic price points, and we all knew that going in. Reasonable price point was $25 a kilogram. Even that is very optimistic, but the expectation is by 2030, 2035, we may be there. We are definitely not there today.
When I'm looking at the battery EVs versus fuel cell EVs and the operational costs and the maintenance numbers vary wildly around the world, how does QTRIC filter through that global data to build reliable models for Canada?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and this is a point of contention. I mean, trust me, we have been ripped apart by environmental groups for being terrible because of how we calculate maintenance. And then we have been ripped apart by fossil fuel groups for being terrible about how we calculate maintenance and other costs. So like, you can never please everyone. So we just focus on what does the science say, what evidence do we have, and what are reasonable assumptions. So on the maintenance side, and this holds for fuel cell buses too, on the bus maintenance side and the charger maintenance side, we take a few different sources of data. One, we take the estimated maintenance cost that manufacturers provide. They will provide estimated maintenance costs based on predicted usage patterns. Okay, that's like the ideal. And we know that it's probably going to be more than that, but at least it gives you a denominator, like a baseline. Then we take a look at other deployments in the United States and CalSTART communities in California, across the US, where we've had these vehicles deployed for many years. And we take a look at their empirical maintenance. We also look at some of the reports that the National Research Labs in the US, NREL, have compiled. So we look at peer review literature like those buses. What are they seeing for maintenance? From the battery to the power electronics to the motor to the vehicle chassis to the chargers and the software upgrades. We include those too, plus the labor to deal with these issues, right? So we look at that. And then the third source of data, though, and this is most important for us, is our own data that we collect. So when we deploy, like we do these commercialization projects, and we did this big battery electric bus high power standardization project with Vancouver, Brampton, York Region years ago. And now other agencies have moved forward deploying their vehicles. There's about 300 vehicles on the road in Canada that are zero emissions. And many of them have loggers on them. And all of the ones that we have helped get on the road have a third party logger on the vehicle. And those loggers and the loggers on the charging system too. We take the data from those loggers and we take the data from the OEM loggers if they have their own telemetry or their own logging device. We pull the actual real world data, which we pull every month from all of the vehicles we track. And we use those empirical findings to show what the maintenance requirements are, because we're able to track from the performance what the reported maintenance was at that time. And through surveys and interviews on top of that data with our transit members, they report to us what their maintenance costs are. So we take all of those things together. And then in cases, we work with the transit agency to ask them what they are comfortable with. And we'll usually have a range of high, like min-max, right? Like we'll do a maximum, what we've seen in literature and performance, a minimum, and we usually land on an average in between for the predictive study. When we go to the empirical, we then monitor what the actual delta is. But I'll give you one example where it can be controversial, right? We did a study with Saskatoon, and if you look at the news media, we were ripped apart because in that study, it was not a real win. Like the battery electrification would save emissions, but only about 10% when you look at well to wheel. Because in Canada, you have to do from manufacturing all the way through to end recycling. You can't do GHGs just on operation. It has to be emissions for the whole life cycle. And Saskatchewan in the prairies has a pretty dirty grid. So for them to decarbonize with just battery electric, they have a fairly dirty grid. The pollution is not a massive drop off, but it is about twice the price of diesels. So it wasn't like a knockout punch. Then when you look at hydrogen, it was in the same zone. So it wasn't like an immediate winner for Saskatoon. And what we suggest with their industry, with their transit agency, is if they are limited and finite amount of money, that their best bet is to get more buses on the road, regardless of the powertrain, and more riders. That's going to be a quicker pollution reduction in the short term. And then let's revisit in 3 years, not just when the tech has improved, but also when they've redesigned their blocks. Because part of the problem was the way the routes are designed to be really energy intense when there's no riders on board. But in that study, we used a maintenance figure that we came to agreement upon with our transit partner. And the goal was to use as much Canadian data as possible. Well, the Canadian data, the buses have not been on the road as much as in the United States, which is why we look at that, or as in Europe. And that means that the data is showing the first 6 months, 12 months of maintenance. Well, in the first few months after commissioning, lots of stuff goes wrong. Anybody can tell you that. Like your first battery electric bus deployment or fuel cell bus, you're learning everything. Stuff goes wrong. Stuff doesn't turn off. Button doesn't light up. The charger doesn't deploy. So your maintenance hours are abnormally high. And so in that average of Canadian data, it is empirically true that the figures we use actually were the figures of maintenance. But our advice is that we redo the study in a couple of years, because that study and that Canadian data, which is why we usually don't just use Canadian data, is skewed right now because so many vehicles are so new. It's the first deployment. Everything that will go wrong in the first 12 months. And so then your maintenance data shows that you have this spike of really expensive maintenance. So we know that maintenance for electric buses and hydrogen should be much lower than diesel. So those are examples where you do your best to come to an agreement about what is reasonable that could go wrong and what the maintenance costs are and what we're seeing everywhere else. Some of the US data we use for maintenance also shows very high spikes, usually in the first year of deployment, right? And I think the industry is just new enough that we don't have like 10 years of data where we can cut the first few years off and take the average of the subsequent 8 years. So every year it gets better and more precise. We expect the maintenance cost to drop off radically for both vehicles.
So some agencies say they're managing the full battery EV coverage using smart charging strategies. So where exactly do fuel cell EVs still make sense in your eyes?
Yeah, even where we have we don't have that many energy as a service management contracts in Canada. Like right now, the only agencies that have outsourced or are internally doing what I would call smart charging is actually Toronto. They've hired an outsourced vendor that works with the utility to manage the charging of the vehicles, to really manage the battery performance, to manage the maintenance and the life cycle. Brampton has just announced that it's going to go with a company much more known in Europe, which is Zenobē. And we do know that there's a few other contracts right now in the pipeline out there being discussed. So we don't have a lot of experience in Canada with truly smart charging. That's the first thing I would say, because most charging that agencies do, if it's smart right now in Canada, it's mostly just the charging system. Like if Siemens or ABB or Schneider has installed a smart charging software system and then pre-programmed charging cycles. Okay, maybe there's some intelligence to the charging cycle, but it's not what we would consider full smart charging, because smart charging would be dynamic throttling up and down, not just with the price of electricity, but on the health of the battery, right? We just don't have a lot of that right now. So, in that regard, I can't say that with smart charging that we have yet enough experience to be able to say, therefore, we are able to maintain those things, and they will run at the most optimal levels in the next couple of years. I expect it will go that way, but it's still debutante industry. So even with that, when we model, we assume some smart charging protocols. We assume battery health management, we assume state of charge management, and we assume that the charging implemented is going to maintain the battery within its optimal zone of performance and never extend beyond the upper minimum bounds of the battery. And the reason we do that is because we assume what the warranty says, which is you can't drop it below 20%. You really shouldn't be charging it regularly above 80%. So we bake that into modeling. With that in the modeling, definitely hydrogen fuel cell electric buses are shown as needed in a portion of the fleet. So again, for many of the agencies we model, if they have more than 200 vehicles, we are seeing anywhere from 10 to 30% of the fleet will need hydrogen fuel cell electric buses, or a very smart charging system plus en route chargers and the biggest battery packs available in the marketplace. You know, I think having lived in Europe for 10 years, even I started to forget how big the distances are in Canada. The distance is big. You know, like just to give people a sense, we have transit agencies where the buses are parked overnight, and before they get to their first stop to pick up their first passenger, they go 100 kilometers. Like the range needs are just very different from Europe. And in the cities, you have constant highway and very large expanses to traverse with not a huge population. So you're talking about like our battery packs, easily 560 kilowatt hours, which is a really big, really heavy, really expensive battery pack, will still not deliver the full range, which is why hydrogen fuel cell tech is, it's by the laws of physics,
Last
needed.
Question for today, and I still say this is a warm-up. If you weren't leading Qtrick and you were just an outside observer, what would you be warning the public about in this industry right now?
From, I think, the adoption side of it, what I would be warning the public about is the ideology that leads to bad procurement. So, and by that I mean, when we started Qtrig, you know, you had people who were adamantly opposed to electrification. Okay, that's one form of ideology that doesn't come from evidence, but it comes from personal experience. Fast forward to today, what you see in the newspaper is some agencies, some folks are ideological about it will be only battery electric, and others are ideological about it will be only hydrogen fuel cell technology. And we now have others who are ideological about it will only be natural gas. It does not help anybody to have ideological, almost quasi-moral political views about technology in something that needs to be as neutral as public transit service. So the idea that there is one holy grail, a panacea, a solution for everyone's problems, that has taken root in our transit system. And that is the biggest single concern that causes delays, because by the time you get the science over the sales and the ideology, 10 years has passed. So I would say if I weren't running Qtrick and I was just an external observer, I'd be seeing that in the news and be worried about that. And so we try to battle that ideological position setting at Qtrick every single day. We're going to need, you know, to fight climate change, we're going to need every solution on the table. Some will be better in some contexts, some will be worse in other contexts. And the ideal is that there are solutions that make companies profit that also decarbonize the earth, because then you don't need to subsidize them. Then they sell themselves. So that's what we're trying to get to.
Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.